Thank you, everyone. I know it's a very busy time of year, so we are very grateful that you're here. Thank you to Allegra and Amram and Pierre for helping organize. Thank you to you all for coming. It's also a busy time of year for you, I assume. Everyone travels on the law school schedule, right?
Yeah, we've got finals next week.
Exactly. So I'm just going to introduce, unless Shane, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Starting right after Shane, we have Tom Malinowski, who is Washington Director for Human Rights Watch and is responsible for the organization's advocacy efforts with the U.S. government. Prior to joining HRW, Tom was Special Assistant to Bill Clinton and Senior Director for Foreign Policy Speechwriting at the National Security Council. Before working in the White House, he was a speechwriter for Secretaries of State Christopher and Albright and a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. Next to Tom, we have Professor Missy Cummings. She was one of the Navy's first female fighter pilots. She received her BS in mathematics from the United States Naval Academy and from the Naval Academy.
Just a couple years ago.
Just a couple years ago, exactly. She's very distinguished couple of years. Her MS in Space Systems Engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School and her PhD in Systems Engineering from the University of Virginia. She was a naval officer and military pilot from 1988 to 1999. Her previous teaching experience includes instructing for the U.S. Navy at Pennsylvania State University and as an assistant professor for the Virginia Tech Engineering Fundamentals Division. And I'm going to list her research interests because I think it says more than anything else, because I can barely pronounce it. Human supervisory control, human unmanned vehicle interaction, bounded collaborative human-computer decision-making, direct perception decision support, simulation and evaluation of human interaction automated systems, and the ethical and social impact of technology. Benjamin Wittes is a senior fellow. A lot of you will know him from Lawfare. He's a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. He co-founded and is the editor-in-chief of the Lawfare blog and is a member of the Hoover Institution's Task Force on National Security and Law. He is the author or editor of a number of publications and books, including Detention and Denial, The Case for Candor After Guantanamo, which was published in November 2011, co-editor of Constitution 3.0, Freedom and Technological Change, and just a number of other publications and ongoing very, very useful posts on Lawfare. Finally, I am pleased to welcome Shane Harris, who will be moderating the panel. Shane Harris is an award-winning author and magazine journalist. His critically acclaimed book, The Watchers, tells the story of 5 men who played central roles in the creation of a vast national security apparatus and the rise of surveillance in America. The Watchers won New York Public Library's Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism, and The Economist named it one of the best books of 2010. Shane is the winner of the 2010 Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Reporting on National Defense. He has 4 times been named a finalist for the Livingston Award for Young Journalists, which honored the best journalist in America under age 35. Shane is currently senior writer at the Washingtonian Magazine. His work has appeared in a huge number of publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Slate, the Daily Beast, analysis at CNN, NPR, very distinguished journalists. So please join me in thanking them and welcoming them to Georgetown.
Great. Thanks for the introductions, and good morning, everybody. So we have a compelling and broad topic here, and 3 people who I think are going to come at this all from distinct and very interesting ways. My job really is to sort of tee it up a bit with introductory remarks, and then to start to have a conversation. And the way we'll do this is the panelists will each give some brief remarks down the line here, and then we'll have some Q&A amongst ourselves and sort of have a discussion, and then we'll move into bringing you all into this as well, which I think is probably we'll kind of divide it in half that way. So I'm just going to ask Tom to start us off and give some opening remarks, and then we'll go on to Missy and then to Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming. What Yara didn't tell you is that my job is just a cover. I was actually sent here from the future to warn you all about the dangers of giving machines the power to police our lives. No one believes me when I say that. Robots are going to be part of our lives in all kinds of ways that we can begin to think about and predict right now, and probably in all kinds of ways that we can't, that our limited imaginations cannot visualize. there are going to be self-driving cars, for better or worse. Incredible applications in industry, and robots will be running our homes probably in ways that will be very delightful and useful. And there are going to be enormous military applications for robotics, including for fully autonomous robotic instruments that will allow soldiers to do things more safely than they could ever do by themselves. And most of that, I think, is great, and most of it is certainly inevitable, even if you don't think it's great. But there are choices that are going to have to be made, and the choices are going to revolve around some really fundamental ethical and moral questions about what the proper relationship between human beings and machines should be as these fantastical advances in robotics and artificial intelligence make increasing uses of robotics possible. What decisions are we going to be comfortable delegating to machines in the future, and what kinds of decisions are we going to decide should remain the realm of human decision makers? And in particular, and this is the subject of our discussion today, in the military realm, should we ever feel comfortable, will we ever feel comfortable, delegating to machines on the battlefield the ability to decide when a human being should live or die? That's the basic question here when you strip all of the kind of complicated technical aspects of the debate aside. And this is partly a legal question. Lawyers have already begun to debate whether international law as it's currently understood would or would not preclude what we refer to as a full lethal autonomy or fully autonomous military machines. But it's not just a legal question. I think at its heart, the question that we're going to have to ask ourselves is, should this be done? Should we go there as a society? And that's a question that the public is going to debate, and that people are going to debate from all kinds of points of view. One doesn't need to believe that the law already precludes this to believe that we should preclude full lethal autonomy. The debate has already begun within the military, and I have to say I find it very interesting. Usually when I talk about human rights issues to military folks, I find that my easiest audience is the JAGs, and the hardest audience is sometimes the operators. In this case, it's actually quite the opposite. When I talk to folks who are, fighter pilots or ship captains or tank commanders, they're the most uncomfortable about the notion that all of their training and experience and mentorship that has formed them into leaders over the years, that somehow that can be replaced by a few lines of computer code. So I think there's already a great deal of discomfort within the military about where the technology might be heading. And as a result, we had late last year one of the few examples of the Pentagon really getting ahead of a debate, a directive that the Pentagon issued, which precludes, for now, the prospect of deploying or developing fully autonomous drones or other military applications. This is just a policy. It's not a legally binding document. It could not have been. It's simply a policy directive produced at a fairly middling level within the Pentagon. But it does reflect, I think, sort of an ethos within our military right now that I strongly agree with, that it would not be a good idea, at least right now, to deploy weapons that can kill autonomously. The problem with this is that the United States is not the only decision maker here. The technology is going to become available to an increasing number of states. And whatever one's ethical views or philosophical views about it, the technology does have advantages on the battlefield for the simple reason that a machine with a computer brain can make decisions much, much more quickly than any human being can. And so if your adversary has them, it's very, very difficult to maintain a policy of self-restraint. And I've talked to folks at the Pentagon who don't want to build this stuff, but who will acknowledge that if the Chinese or the Russians do, the United States will likely have no choice. And so as we think about the future of these weapons, we have to think about not just sort of what we think the United States might want to do in the next 10 years, but we have to think about what other actors will do. We're not going to be the only decision makers, and we have to think several generations ahead. Because in a world without restraint and regulation that's agreed to by multiple parties, there is a very real risk of an arms race in which countries make decisions based on what their adversaries do. And then we have to ask, do we want to go there? Are we going to be better off or worse off if we have that kind of future? And my view is that we will not be better off. And it's based fundamentally on the belief that the decisions that an ethical soldier has to make on the battlefield are incredibly complex and incredibly subtle, and not likely in any foreseeable future to be replicated by even the most advanced artificial intelligence. Could a machine soldier, these are kind of the questions that I ask myself, could it exercise distinction? Could it distinguish between civilians and combatants on a battlefield? Well, if they're wearing uniforms, then one can imagine that they could, but we have seen in recent conflicts that combatants, adversaries often don't wear uniforms. That the ability to distinguish between the enemy and civilians who are protected under international law is actually this is not an easy thing to do. Proportionality. Would we be comfortable with a machine determining the value of a human life, which is what one has to do when one does a proportionality analysis? Could a machine read the intentions of human beings that it encounters on the battlefield in the way that we as human beings can read another person's intentions by their mannerisms, by their expressions, by what they do and what they say? Could a machine communicate with the people that it encounters? If I see soldiers patrolling my neighborhood, I want to be able to approach them. I want to be able to explain myself to them, to direct their attention, to change their behavior through communication. Could a machine interact with people in that way? Would a machine be able to show mercy, deciding not to use force, even in situations where it would be lawful? Would a machine understand the strategic objectives that it's supposed to be fighting for, in addition to the tactical objectives which might be programmed into it in the way that a human soldier would? Would a machine be able to adapt to the reality of a constantly changing battlefield? We can always program machines to meet contingencies that can be predicted, but of course on a real battlefield things change all the time. Human beings have the capacity to adapt in ways that I don't think even the most advanced artificial intelligence will. And then to me, what's always been sort of the clincher, could a machine do something that human soldiers throughout the centuries have rarely done, but sometimes do to very, very important effect, and that is to refuse orders. And I wonder about this in particular because I'm convinced that if these weapons are developed, they're not just going to be deployed by the United States and Sweden. They're going to be deployed by dictatorships. They're going to be deployed by countries that primarily see them as a way of controlling domestic unrest and domestic opposition. I imagine a future Bashar Assad with an army of fully autonomous weapons 30 years from now, 50 years from now. And we've seen time after time in history that one of the limits on the ability of unscrupulous leaders to do terrible things to their people and to others is that human soldiers, their human enforcers, have certain limits. There are moments when they say no, and those are moments when those regimes fall. Robotic soldiers would never say no. And I'd like us not to go there. The counter-argument to all this that you sometimes hear, well, we'll probably hear others today as well, but one counter-argument is that from an ethical point of view, actually having robots on the battlefield might offer some advantages. They don't have emotions. They're not going to get angry. They're not going to go berserk. They're not going to want to get revenge on an enemy that has killed one of its buddies on the battlefield. They are not going to get tired in the way that a human being can. All these things contribute to acts of violence and to war crimes on the battlefield, as we all know. And I think that's absolutely right. But I think that virtually all of those advantages can be had with remote-controlled robotic weapons, like our current generation of drones and future generations that are being developed that will do similar things, both land-based and aerial weapons, that will be able to approach a target autonomously, that will be able to navigate in the most dangerous circumstances without a human being on board risking his or her life, but where a human being is still controlling the ultimate decision to fire the weapon or not to fire a weapon. So we get all those advantages, and I don't see what additional advantage we gain by taking the human being out of the loop. So my view, the view of Human Rights Watch, is that a decision does need to be made before these weapons are developed, before they become ubiquitous, before we have an arms race, before it's too late to put the genie in the bottle. That there does need to be, to begin with, a clear international norm that nations would be asked to agree to. But at the very least, we require that whenever a decision is made in warfare to take a human life, that a human being be in the loop in making that decision. If we were to agree to that, I think the rest would flow. There would be important challenges that would still need to be met in terms of crafting an international agreement or treaty that would be enforceable, that would capture the definitions accurately, that would be effective, and that would allow work on robotics and autonomy to proceed in the multiple other areas in which we would not have any ethical concerns about it, and indeed in which it would be very beneficial. And then perhaps, if at some later point in the future, the technology has advanced to such a point that a consensus develops that we actually could risk giving machines this power, maybe we'll get there in 100 years. We can always resume, the technology will be there. My fear is that if we allow that to happen and then wait and see, it will be too late to put the genie back into the bottle. So I believe we ought to start by asserting the principle that the Pentagon, in fact, has already asserted for itself, that there should always be a man in the loop, and try to forge international agreement to adhere to that principle so that we avoid an arms race. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Tom, for laying out all those points. So now we're going to turn to Missy Cummings. And I will give you fair warning, too, in the discussion. You are our resident technologist expert on this, so I may be returning to you to sort of tell us what ground truth is on the technology, at least as we know it today. So, but please, go ahead.
Because I am a former fighter pilot, that means I can tell stories all day long to entertain you. I thought about just saying, after Tom, I thought about saying, I agree. Okay, on to Ben. And because that's ultimately what my personal position is. But I am an engineer, I am a technologist, so I thought I'd paint the picture for you of just UAVs in general, what you like to refer to as drones, and there's a whole other entertaining discussion about how the names came about in the first place. But that I can tell you later. But let me tell you what the status is right now of the technology. So I find it kind of funny and somewhat, it is definitely amusing to me that every time I pick up the papers, there's this media onslaught about these issues that we're talking about today. But as the technologist in the room, I'm telling you, to me, they are important issues and they're issues to be addressed. But the general public does not understand just how far advanced this technology is, and that the military use of UAVs is about to become a very trivial use of the technology in comparison of what the explosion is you're going to see around the rest of the world in many other settings. So, for example, probably the next big domain that's going to explode in UAVs is agriculture. Robotic tractors are already there, but we're going to see a lot more increase of airplanes for things like crop dusting, crop health monitoring. Japan as a nation has almost turned over its entire crop dusting to robots, flying robots. I think after agriculture, you're going to see cargo kind of in this very small corner of the world in Afghanistan. 2 little robotic helicopters have been working like that little train that can. In about a year, these 2 helicopters have carried over 3 million pounds of cargo by themselves, shuttling back and forth. And it seems like kind of a small data point, except that when you've got 2 little helicopters able to carry that kind of capacity with no accidents, taking Marines off the road, saving a lot of lives, it doesn't take a big reach in imagination to guess that FedEx and UPS are not far behind, and they are. They're definitely actively seeking how to take the human out of the cockpit for cargo flights for cost reasons and also safety. And I'll talk about that, the safety issue in a little bit more in a few minutes. So, you know, and there'll be many other domains. In fact, gas line, pipeline, infrastructure inspection, bridges, those are also up-and-coming areas, and even entertainment. So if you were in London a couple of weeks ago, you got to see an amusing formation of UAVs flying around the London sky in the shape of the Star Trek logo, because they were doing a big PR gig for the new Star Trek movie coming out. And UAVs around the world are in operas, for example. So I think there's a whole nother dimension to drones that people do not really get because they don't really understand the state of the technology. But that's important for you to remember, because when we start to see the commercial explosion of development in the vehicles, that's actually, there's going to be a push-pull effect about what happens in the military. When a technology goes commercial and that kind of money, which is actually much more substantial than the DoD, gets poured into a technology, you'll see all kinds of new advancements in ways that you never thought possible. So that's the good side of technology. The bad side is, and I'm talking in the current state of the art, there are still issues with safety and reliability. It's gotten a lot better. So a very interesting event occurred just a few months ago, probably about 6 months ago, that again kind of flew under the radar. UAV safety, measured in accidents per 100,000 flight hours, that's kind of the standard. UAVs surpassed fighter and bomber pilots in the military. That means that if you need to do a mission today, it is safer to send a UAV than to send a manned platform inside the military. About 3 years ago, UAVs surpassed general aviation. Anybody here a private pilot? Anybody here like to fly around on the weekends? I'm the only one. So it's the people who are out there at the local airports who can no longer fly because all the towers were just shut down by the FAA. It's probably not a bad thing. General aviation has had a high accident rate for a long time. It really hasn't budged that much in the last 20 years. People are terrible drivers, and as far as the general population, they're also terrible pilots. And there's a whole bunch of reasons: lack of training, lack of standardization. We do actually have commercial pilots that like to text and taxi at the same time. So, if we've got that kind of distraction problem in the cockpit for commercial pilots, you can only imagine how bad it is for your 5th to 95th percentile in general aviation. So now that it's been established that UAVs are much safer than general aviation, you have to ask yourself, well, what's the threat to you as the person on the ground walking around? Today, it's better for you to have planes, general aviation planes, flown by the computer than it is by a human if you're walking around on the ground. If that safety trend holds, and it's not likely that, it's been a huge decrease in accidents. The rate is very steep. If that were to hold, that would mean that commercial aviation, that UAVs would pass commercial pilots in about 10 years. So in about 10 years, theoretically, you would be safer flying on a drone to London than you would be if a human was in the cockpit. Now, that's an arguable point, but I just throw that out there. to basically anchor your expectations of where the technology is in terms of flying itself around, getting from point A to B, because that's really what UAVs do the best. In the context of the kinds of decisions that Tom and everyone else is talking about in terms of what about pulling the trigger, for a lot of technical reasons that we could perhaps discuss, maybe if questions come up, there's no way in the foreseeable future that autonomy, either on board a UAV or a ground robot, has the ability to discriminate in the kinds of ways that we're talking about right now. We could discuss later about the nature of algorithms, and I know that Shane had asked me to talk about what's the definition of autonomy. This is a big technical debate about what is automated and what is autonomous. Something is autonomous when it has to reason in the presence of uncertainty. We like to use a really big word to make you feel stupid. We like to say stochastic, so that when you hear professors say, oh, it's a stochastic system, that's our way to make you feel stupid because only we understand what that secret word means. But it means uncertainty. And so the more uncertain an environment is, that's when you need to bring in autonomous technologies, which are basically using probabilistic reasoning algorithms to understand the situation, as opposed to a deterministic algorithm where, like when you go home and set your temperature in your house, you set it to 72, and once a sensor detects that it's at 73, then the air conditioning kicks on. This is a deterministic system because we know what the world is around us, and then we can adjust the control algorithms accordingly. So, and I appreciate Tom saying that, about the DoD. The DoD really did step out with their instruction 3001, I think is what it is, and say that no automated killing will happen, that a human will always be in the loop. And I will tell you that the military will be the last group of people to ever agree to allow a system to autonomously fire. There's a lot of social, cultural issues there. You have to ask yourself, if you're in the military and robots are doing your job, then why would you be in the military anyway, right? We see this as a huge battle going on in the Air Force. If the Air Force is all about pilots, and in fact the Air Force now has more planes that are unmanned than manned and more unmanned operators than pilots, what does that make people in the Air Force, right? So this distrust of technology is pervasive, and in kind of a, in a nice way, our distrust of the automation is providing a necessary brake to prevent out-of-control development. So I think, the humans' inability, they don't like to accept the fact that they're going to be replaced by something better. That is actually working for us in our favor right now. I do agree with all the points about, this technology could be nefarious. It can be developed in all these terrible ways, and it's good that we're having this conversation. But I will tell you, the cat got out of the bag a while ago in terms of technologies starting to develop in ways that I think maybe we didn't really appreciate. We have missiles right now, and it was always for a fighter pilot, and they're our favorite missiles. They're called Amrams. And what you do is you fly up in the air, you try to shoot somebody from as far away as possible. I mean, the whole point about being a fighter pilot is you want to shoot that other guy before he shoots you. So the person who has the longest spear is the person that's going to win this game. And so we want our missiles that fire away from as far as possible. Well, we have this one missile that, using some radar support from the aircraft, an Amram, you basically get a lock on a distant target, and you're basically getting a frequency signature. And then you shoot that missile, and you run like crazy. And the point is that the missile then by itself starts to track the bad guy, and then no matter which way the bad guy moves, the missile will move accordingly. And in fact, this was actually the same principle as heat-seeking missiles. Once it's got a heat signature in front of it, it will actually go after that heat signature until it explodes. So Amrams they're pretty good. They're not perfect. Sometimes if you shoot at a bunch of aircraft or in a tight cluster, the frequency shift is, there's signal to noise ratio in there, and in fact the Amram can shift from target to target, so it might not always get it right, but it gets it right most of the time, which is why we use it. And I bring up that technology to give you an example of, the missile's not a robot, or is it? You know, where do we draw that line? There is some probabilistic reasoning on board an Amram. It's pretty crude, and it's not as advanced as what we might be using today in other systems, although you could argue, what does it mean to be advanced? It's pretty crude, but it's also pretty good. And but we've allowed these weapons to be developed that have the ability to take over on their own once the pilot has run away. And it's not the only technology, by the way. There's many other weapon types for all the branches of the service that follow a similar principle. So it's out there. So you have to ask ourselves, well, where to draw the line is actually pretty difficult. So I think it's great that we're having this discussion. I think it's important for the United States to lead the way in this discussion. I do support, I cannot think of one person in the military that does not also support an international agreement that a human should always be in the loop. And I can promise you the military will always be there because the military wants to preserve their job, if nothing else. But where the rest of the world is going to go is up for debate. And as this technology really starts to come online in all kinds of ways, you know, I think that the pace of technological development is outpacing all of this, and will sneak up upon probably not this country as much as it is other places.
Thanks, Missy. We've been hearing you talk about also commercial aviation and the applications for this. I'm reminded with the discussion I had a year or so ago with a former commercial pilot who said that they used to joke that in the future there would be a human and a dog in the cockpit, and the dog would be there to bite the human if he tried to take control of the aircraft. So it's something that, you know, within the culture of pilots, I think it's something that people probably think a lot about. Yeah. Okay, so Ben Wittes.
Back in the 60s, I guess before he started making movies, when he used to do stand-up comedy, Woody Allen told a joke that his father had been fired from his job after 30 years with the same company. He was let go. It was a very sad day for the family. He was replaced with a little machine this big. It did everything his father did, only it did it much better. And the really sad part was that his mother had gone out and bought one. And so I want to start by just pointing out that job protection for military people and the actual IHL and humanitarian value or negative value of autonomous systems are not the same problem. And we should actually separate them and talk about them separately. About 100 years ago, before the Woody Allen joke, the world looked at the technological future and saw a menace, and it passed an international convention to preemptively ban an emerging class of technology that was so terrifying and so menacing that we simply had to get together and make sure that it never got used in warfare. And I'm talking about, of course, hot air balloons. If you look at I believe the 1897 Hague Resolution, there's this provision, the United States is signatory to it, that called balloon warfare, and it bans it. And I mention this only to point out that the history of human certainty about the direction of technology is a very iffy proposition. We're not good at identifying where technology is going, how we should feel about it. By World War I, this was moot. By World War II, it was really moot. And so, you know, this is not something that we're good at, is sort of figuring out where technology is going. And for that reason, I don't want to sit here and make an affirmative case for fully autonomous weapon systems. I've never argued for them. Tom has actually made fun of me about this. I've argued for agnosticism about them, that I can imagine, and I think we should all keep in mind that we're kind of bad at predicting where things are going, and therefore we don't want to be the authors of the Balloon Warfare Convention. And so what I want to do is I want to make three basic points that I think kind of lead ineluctably to this posture of agnosticism. And the first of them is that people suck. You know, there's this romanticism that infects a lot of this conversation, which is that there's something ineffable about human judgment that is, and there is something ineffable about human judgment, but that is irreplaceably valuable and good. So I just want to point out that of all the war crimes committed in the 20th century, and you're accounting for, you know, tens of millions of people, none of them was committed by anything other than that human judgment. And so we're not starting from a baseline in which, you know, human autonomous firing power should be considered a wonderful thing. And if you look at, well, I'm going to pick on Tom because he picks on me. If you look at all of Human Rights Watch's reports on all the terrible things that are going on in the world, it's not robots they're complaining about. It's people. And so I don't start with the assumption that it isn't imaginable that we could improve on that performance with a certain degree of technological development that might, and when I say might, I mean might or might not take place. So, three propositions. That was the people suck one is kind of a preliminary proposition. First one is we really don't know where the technology is going. We're bad at predicting it. We have been bad, of all the things we have been bad at predicting, system autonomy is actually high on the list of things that we've been too enthusiastic about anticipating is just around the corner and hasn't been. You know, Alan Turing imagined fully thinking systems a long time ago, and he thought they were close. And in every generation since then, every 10 years, we sort of think it's 10 years off, and it turns out to be 10 years off until it's 10 years off. On the other hand, we can build robots now that can do all kinds of incredible things. And so the parts of human judgment that we are capable of replicating, improving on, and the parts that we are simply not capable remains a kind of mysterious thing that we're actually not good at getting to. And therefore, I think it is perfectly possible. And I'm specifically not attaching a time horizon to this because I don't know what time horizon I'm talking about, and I don't purport to know. But it's perfectly plausible to me that over time horizon X, we will emerge in a world in which, for some applications, robots can do things dramatically better than humans can, including some firing applications. For some applications, they do significantly worse. And for some applications, they do about the same. All of this leads me to think that a blanket rule of any kind is very ill-advised. So Tom acknowledged the possibility in his remarks that you could imagine a situation in which robots might be better at greater distances of identifying people in uniform. So imagine a situation 25, 30 years from now in which we don't know, we're still caught in the problem where, you know, if people are out of uniform, if you're dealing with a situation, people are those who are fighting are not in uniform, there's no standardized dress, there's no standardized weapon systems, there's no, you know, in an Iraq-like insurgency environment, there's no application for autonomous firing in that situation. But boy, robots are good at figuring out whether someone's in a North Korean army uniform. And in the DMZ, you know, there are actually civilians. And so the question is really, is the person the other side or not? And I could imagine a situation in which you had certain applications in which robots did dramatically better than people, much the way Missy describes in the flight context. Robots are getting to the point that they just do better than general aviation, or they're past the point. The fundamental command of international law is comes down to discrimination and accuracy, doing the best you can to make judgments based on the information available to you. You have to discriminate to the best degree you can, right? You have to engage in a proportionality analysis. So my very modest proposition is that you cannot say preemptively, and you should not say preemptively, that there will never come a time when those values will not require you to use technologies that may enable you to do a much better job than you can do now. Now, would I feel differently about this if humans were perfect or near perfect in their judgments regarding this stuff? Yeah, I'd feel differently about it. Would I feel differently about it if all applications were sufficiently similar, all firing applications were sufficiently similar, that you could say, because I'm confident that we'll never get to the point that robots can distinguish insurgents from civilians in urban Baghdad, that we therefore couldn't use them, for example, to target enemy submarines autonomously. I don't think of those applications as so similar, or even remotely similar, enough to allow one to judge the other. And so what I want to leave you with is just the simple idea that we don't need a preemptive rule. We have fundamental rules of distinction, proportionality, humanity. We have no desire on the part of the military, as both of my co-panelists have said, to deploy unmanned, fully autonomous weapon systems at this point. And we have no immediate prospect of the development of such systems at a level that would make their deployment attractive. So we don't actually have a problem. And I think it is worth a certain modesty in imagining the future and not putting ourselves in the shoes where we've seen a balloon and have confused it with a Terminator.
Thanks, Ben. I want to start the discussion by actually turning to Tom and asking you to pick up right where Ben laid out this case. I mean, he's made an argument for why we should not have preempt in law the use of these technologies, which I think Missy has done a good job of telling us, maybe they're in the future, but they're not quite here yet precisely in a way that they might be used in battle. Your organization had circulated a petition calling on the president to preemptively ban, the use of autonomous lethal systems or killer robots, if you want to call it that. Why do you think that's a good idea and something that's necessary to do now?
Well, if you agree that there's a potential danger here, there are two ways to approach that potential. One is to wait and see what happens. Wait until we and other countries begin to develop these systems, incorporate them into planning, incorporate them into how we do warfare, see how it goes, see whether in fact they are better at distinction and proportionality and everything else, as some suggest, than humans may be, or if in fact they turn out to be quite bad at making the kinds of very difficult, subtle judgments that I think one requires a human being on the battlefield to make, and then make a decision. But my concern is that if it turns out badly, it will be too late to make an effective decision, because if these weapons are ubiquitous, if other governments have them and they provide them with an advantage on the battlefield, and certainly they will at a certain point provide an advantage on the battlefield, it becomes very, very difficult to turn back the clock. The other alternative is to say what the Pentagon essentially has said, which is we are going to follow this principle of a man in the loop. A human being makes that decision. And because we think it's in our interest to do that, we're going to try to persuade other countries to make exactly the same commitment. That's how you do a treaty. And then, if 50 years from now, 100 years from now, the technology has advanced to a point, and the technology will advance regardless. People will be working on robotics. They will be working on a wide variety of autonomous applications. That when we look at this again in 50 or 100 years from now, we're quite confident, based on all the self-driving cars and planes and the robots we're interacting with on the street and doing all kinds of things that we can only begin to imagine, that we can actually trust them to make the kill decision. We'll be able to do that. The technology will exist. So it's a much safer approach to uncertainty, in my view, to start with a preemptive rule that says we are going to maintain a human being in the role of the decision maker for use of lethal force.
This may be a stretch of an analogy, but I wonder what you think of what the other panelists think. I mean, it strikes me that in the development of nuclear weapons, right, this technology develops rather quickly. There's a display of its potential, of its actual force. And then the world kind of stops and says, we need to start making treaties to control this, and that seems to have worked pretty well. So is there something about this particular technology that says that we shouldn't do it that way? I mean, in a sense, why not? I guess what I'm saying is, go ahead, develop the potential to create these autonomous systems, let's see what they do, and then trust that, we have experience in then crafting treaties and restricting ourselves from using it and pulling back. Or is there something about the technology that is just so pervasive or so irresistible, or that is going to become so diffuse that you can't kind of put the genie back in the bottle?
Well, it's going to be much more pervasive and diffuse than nuclear explosions.
Right, for sure.
So clearly, that's what I
But there'll be other applications for it too, non-lethal as well, that factor into that, I take it as well. I mean, the idea that once you whet someone's appetite for robotic technology in all its forms, it becomes somewhat, more irresistible, I guess.
So I think one of the factors is that, both for the reasons that Missy described earlier, but also for other reasons, autonomy is a spectrum. It's not a binary thing. Systems are not either autonomous or not, or automated or not. There are degrees of autonomy, there are degrees of automation. And, one thing that happens is that you develop systems that could be, that give you a huge amount of information, and then you decide whether to, you the human, decide whether to push the button or not. On the other hand, the problem with that is that then adds an element of time, right? And so you develop this situation in which, some of the missile defense systems that, the Iron Dome system is an example of this in Israel. It collects all kinds of data, it flashes to the person that something's coming in, and then the person has to decide whether to click that button and take it down. I think the most time-consuming element of that system's operation is that human element. And so you can imagine lots of situations in which people decide that the costs of that added time wildly exceed the benefit of having that human involved in the decision. And I think some of the pressure, I think the pressure toward fully autonomous systems will probably come less from the sort of desire to build a super drone that goes out there and finds all the nasty Shane Harrises in the world and takes them out.
There's only one.
Then it will from some desire to eliminate that time element. Mm-hmm. And I think actually it's worth focusing on that time element, because I think it tees up both Tom's moral concerns and also the values on the other side in a kind of an elegant way. What do you get for having the person there in that situation, and what do you lose by having the person there in that situation?
Well, then I think that clarifies things. That's a very good way of looking at it. And take your example of the guy in the DMZ that you suggested before. Again, you have the DMZ. There are no civilians. There aren't supposed to be any civilians, at least. And somebody is walking across, and it's possible that that a machine will be able to detect at a greater distance with greater accuracy whether the person crossing is a North Korean soldier. But then again, you could also have a machine that does all of that work, right? That detects who is coming across. Is the person wearing a uniform? Is the person carrying a gun? Whatever other parameters you program into it. But you could still have a human being at the console, at a safe position, who sees all that information. The image flashes on the screen, and they still have to make that final and fateful decision. Now, what do we gain and what do we lose? What we lose, as you just pointed out, is an element of time, because the human being will take at least a few seconds to look at that image on the screen, take it all in, and think, can I press this trigger? They're thinking I may be held accountable if I make a mistake, which is another important element that we haven't discussed. So yeah, they're going to take a few moments to decide, and in some circumstances, perhaps that loss of time is critical, although I think in your scenario, it's hard to imagine one person crossing the DMZ. It would be critical there. What would be the gain? I still think even in that circumstance, there are things that a human being might notice that a machine might not notice. It could be a combatant, but maybe he's coming across to surrender. There may be something about gestures that he is making, or the way in which he's carrying himself, or just something subtle that a human being would pick up that a machine would not, that would cause the human being to say, you know what, maybe not, we're not going to kill this guy. Or something else that we can't really predict in advance, and therefore can't program into the decision-making algorithm of the computer, but a human being looking at that image would notice and pick up. So I think in that example, the cost-benefit, with the cost being loss of time and the potential benefit, would weigh heavily in favor of keeping a human being in the loop. Missile defense is different, but then you're firing on an inanimate object. You're not firing on a human.
But let's focus, if we can, on. I love the example that you just gave in the DMZ. But let me tweak it a little bit. Now it's not one person coming across the DMZ. It's 300 people coming across the DMZ at the same time in the context of an artillery barrage. Okay? And you have a lot of data over a long period of time that suggests, much as Missy's description of the general aviation and UAV data, that the more autonomous the decision-making is, A, the higher the kill rate that you have of the enemy. B, the fewer mistakes you have in the form of friendly fire or other mistakes. You're not going to have civilian issues in that context, very likely. And three, that that everything that you value over time in terms of effectiveness is better the less human involvement you have, precisely because there turn out to be very few instances of where that human judgment that you're describing in that context turns out to be very important. But there turn out to be a lot of instances in which people are firing because they're angry, because they just lost somebody a few weeks earlier, because, and so what you end up getting is a situation in which you can get better results by any metric you want by having more rather than less autonomy. Now, I'm not asserting that that's the reality. I don't think we're anywhere near the technological pivot point at which we would have to make that decision. I'm just saying that I'm not willing to say that I know that that won't be the reality in a way that would make me confident enough to preemptively ban technologies that don't yet exist.
Let me ask Missy to come in here, and I not to settle this.
Don't get me involved.
Right. But putting on your technologist hat first, tell us to what extent the technology as it is today can make the kinds of distinctions and can judge the sort of subtleties of body language or maybe people moving in mass. If it's not there now, again, caveated, how far away do you think it is? But also then put on your sort of military and operator hat. How attractive would that kind of a system be to, forces in the DMZ. I mean, can you imagine that that is something that if a machine existed that could make those distinctions and report that information very quickly, that the military would say, absolutely, put that into place right away as soon as you can?
So in terms of where we are in the state of the art, the words artificial intelligence are actually no longer used in academia. And the reason is because they carry such negative connotation now, because there have been a lot of AI promises over the last 20, 30 years, and I mean, Ben, you said it's every 10 years, we're still 10 years in the future. And so computer scientists and anybody who attaches themselves to artificial intelligence right now is really kind of looked down on. So in a very clever ruse, now the whole community has basically changed that name to machine learning. So now you'll never see a proposal in academia to talk about artificial intelligence. Now we say machine learning.
That'll fool everyone.
I know. Well, it's amazing.
The secret's out now.
And so it's very faddish, right? So if you want to get money from the government right now, you talk about machine learning. It's just the same people. So I give you that historical background to tell you, if we're at the point in history where we're having to change our name because we just haven't produced what we said we were going to produce, it's not looking good for autonomy anytime soon in terms of trying to figure these things out. I find that there's a really interesting hubris in the machine learning community and in academia in general about the capabilities of algorithms, computational systems, and one of the core elements, the key piece to why we haven't been able to develop more autonomy is because we cannot replicate these two sensors, which when I teach, I tell my students those are the two best sensors ever built. But it's not because you have a retina attached to an iris or however, your rods and cones. Why are these the two best sensors ever built? Because they're connected to another organ, a brain. And while we could maybe build an artificial eye, we are very, very, very far away from building an artificial brain. And so these technologies are, so for the principle of discrimination, a set of sensors right now, even the best set of sensors, I'm helping the Navy with a robotic helicopter program right now. We're really struggling with detecting a pond of water that's 2 inches deep, or a pond or lake that same size. It could be 50 feet deep, and sensors technology simply cannot do that. Face recognition has come a long way, but there's some problems. It's not at the high rate that you would ever hope for example, for absolute detection with any, what we say, 10 to the minus 6 uncertainty. You're absolutely sure that person is who that person says. I mean, there's just things you can do. You can grow a beard, you can change your hair, you can have plastic surgery, right? I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can manipulate your face to trick automation. And there's a funny book out there, I forget the name of it, but it's about if the robot revolution comes, how to disguise yourself. And it says, wear a long trench coat, because a long trench coat can absolutely defeat any set of sensors right now in either determining man, woman, legs, arms, what's under the trench coat. Are you hostile? Are you not hostile?
You just programmed the robot to kill anyone in a trench coat.
Well, right. So now we have what about London? They're in big trouble, right?
But we're safe from flashers.
Yeah, well, we're not sure about that, right? So we could be setting ourselves up, right? So we're not close. We're not even close to being close. The sensor problem, it's what they call computer vision. It's the long pole in the tent, and we are very, very far away. Unless, who knows? Any day, maybe a set of people in a garage in Cambridge will get together and come up with some new revolutionary system. But the issue is really, it's not just the sensor, it's actually the probabilistic reasoning algorithms, because the sensor, like a camera, has to be connected to a computer to do the same thing that your eyes and brain do, right? And so we don't have that figured out. Lots of people are trying, and so that will be where the advances come. Now, I've already forgotten your second question. So if I'm a military person, can I envision the DMZ, a situation in the DMZ? So
yeah, that technology being attractive.
Strategically, the only time automated weaponry becomes critical is in time-critical situations, right? So I would actually say the DMZ, I think both of you are using a terrible example because the DMZ is not really that great. I mean, it's very unlikely that we have such clearly demarcated areas in the first place that, you know, bad versus good. And, you know, I've actually been to the DMZ, and, you know, that's like a dream for a military person in terms of certainty of bad versus good. So I think what you're really talking about is, what if you have more of an urban environment and, you know, like somebody comes up to blow up themselves, they've got a vest bomb, and they want to blow up right next to a bus. I mean, I think that's actually a much more relevant today, and will likely be more relevant in the future. What if you had technologies? What if you had, like, on light posts, you could imagine, like, little sniper guns. And as soon as somebody pulled off that vest, the sniper gun could tag that guy. Now, I think, you know, I mean, because there's something in the human called the neuromuscular lag. What that means is that you have about a half a second latency hardwired into you. So if I go like that, and now I look like it's a spring break. It is, woo, spring break. You know, I'm just so grateful there were not cell phones when I was your age and I was in spring break. I'm just telling you.
I want to hear those stories.
Yeah, right. So the vest is seen, and let's say you can absolutely identify the dynamite right here, right? A human brain takes at least a half a second to see that, and probably at least another half a second to bring out a weapon. So, I mean, at the best Clint Eastwood or whatever gunslinger we have today would take at least a second to do that. And that person will, because that person doesn't have a half-second neuromuscular lag, because they've already gone that far, right? So all they have to do is pull. And this is what makes automation so great. If we could develop a sensor, that sensor, it takes it on the order of microseconds to detect the dynamite, and on the order of microseconds to fire a bullet. So there's no question in that scenario that the automation would be better than a human. No question. But the question is, how do we actually then make sure that we had a sensor that could detect the dynamite, could be in a position to fire, without having to have a human in the loop? So, I mean, this is why it's shaky ground. You know, I think it's great for us to have the debate, but we can certainly envision scenarios because of the human neuromuscular lag and because of the threat. You know, this is where the threat of proportionality starts to come into question. You know, if we could kill one suicide bomber a month using the Missy Cummings clever, you know, light post technology, and we killed accidentally, let's just say, you know, one person every 3 years or 5 years, you know, where would we feel about that, right? I mean, I think that's the discussion we have to have.
Yeah, we would reject it. I mean, I've no...
So where is that?
I've no doubt that if we put that to a vote, you know, have a sniper on lampposts, and you know, even if we knew it was more reliable, and would at a certain point, of course, it would be more reliable for the reasons that you described, than having a police officer in every corner with the time lag, with, you know. But remember, that time lag is not just a weakness; it's also a strength, because we use that time to consider other possibilities. Maybe it's not a terrorist. Maybe something else is in that backpack. Yes, the sensor will eventually get to a point where it can actually detect the chemical signature of dynamite, but, you know, there are people in our society who have the chemical signature of dynamite on them for perfectly legitimate reasons, right? So you would have in that scenario some error rate, and I just don't think people would tolerate turning over that kind of decision, which could result in their death, their wrongful death, to a system of machines. And the second point, it wouldn't just be a law-abiding country like the United States that deploys that system. If Assad or Gaddafi or the Chinese government could deploy that system today, we can imagine how this would be used. So, you talk about what Human Rights Watch is concerned about in the world, Ben. I mean, this is what it comes back to me, that these technologies, we don't live in a world in which the United States is the only decision maker. We have to imagine in the real world, if the technology was ubiquitous, if it was being produced on a massive scale and available to those who wanted to buy it, how would it actually be used, and would it make the world better or worse?
Go ahead, Ben.
So just for the record, this is a way more radical example than anything that I would contemplate. But I do think if you posit a system, and let's just to make it even faintly realistic, not imagine it put on every lamppost, but imagine it put at certain checkpoints where you plausibly imagine that suicide bombers are coming through. I think I actually agree with Tom that you would have to have a vanishingly close to zero error rate to imagine deploying such a system. On the other hand, let's be candid about the costs of not deploying such a system as Missy just described it. Because if you have a low but real rate of false positives, that is, false positives that lead to kills, versus a much lower rate of human recognition, you have a higher rate of suicide bombings going off and killing, presumably, civilians. And so this is actually an interesting example of a situation in which you may be willing to accept higher rates of civilian casualties in order to preserve a kind of purity of a vision of the unacceptability of this machine. Now, as I say, I would not contemplate the deployment of said machine, but I think we need to be candid when we say that, what the trade-off is, and what the trade-off is dead civilians. And so, I actually think that there's it's an elegant example of a number of the moral difficulties and some of the legal difficulties here. And ask yourself this question, just as a matter of IHL. If the fundamental command is reduction of civilian casualties, isn't there an oddity, right? If you're obliged as a matter of IHL, as a general matter, to take reasonable steps to reduce civilian casualties, or to not have unnecessary civilian casualties, isn't it an odd thing to ban the production or use of a system knowing that the result of it will be fewer civilian casualties? And that said, when I listen to Missy describe this machine, I'm morally horrified by it. So I don't present my own instinct about it as consistent, but I do think it brings up a lot of the nuances of the both legal and moral complexities that we're talking about.
Just to stick with this example of Missy's system, I wonder, do you fundamentally overcome the problem if you make it non-lethal? In other words, a system that tases somebody.
I was wondering how long does it take somebody. So the real solution to this, though, is, the funny thing about it is, if we're really that good, we actually don't need to have a bullet that would do it. Or you could have some kind of bullet that would be designed to impact on the surface of the skin and knock someone out, right, and incapacitate them. So the answer is, in my mind, is that we do need to spend more time developing non-lethal systems, because, in fact, in that same situation, the government is already working on this heat ray, and now we have a more nuanced discussion, right? What if we know that we can blast that guy, and knock him out, and there's a chance he might die? I think, we'll live with that chance. But that there might be people injured in a 5-foot radius. I think that's a more likely scenario that we have to deal with. But I want to kind of pull you back and provoke you in one other way. So this crazy example I gave you with the sniper on the light post, this is in your everyday life right now. This is Google. This is the Google car. So as much as we sit around and we talk about UAVs and lethality of UAVs and should we not be going there, I think what's going on with the Google car is far more heinous, and it's far more in our real world face. Google's situation is right now, they are developing, and it's legal to drive in a couple of states now, a fully autonomous car. And this is a highly autonomous system, which means it works on uncertainties. Google's stated policy is that it will reduce deaths. It will reduce the 37,000 traffic deaths we have a year. That's where the number, I think maybe it's 35,000, sits in the U.S. And when you ask them about the risk of hitting one pedestrian, the Google approach is very utilitarian. Well, if we save 37,000, 35,000 lives and we risk running over one pedestrian, where is the balance, right? So I mean, I think human rights need to go after Google, because I think that this situation is actually because, and the thing is, we don't think about it because there's not a weapon involved. But when you talk about a car and a car moving in urban, this is a far more real threat to humans, I think, than in the present term. But it actually, that example I gave you of the light post, it's very similar to the one we have in our real red light.
Can I just flesh that out, because I actually don't entirely understand. So their position is that it will reduce in the aggregate, but it will make mistakes that humans will not make.
Very rarely. That's what they say.
So it's really directly parallel.
It's directly parallel, right? And so, but now...
Although it doesn't involve intentional killing. Right. So, I mean, the Google car is hugely interesting, and there are a lot of dilemmas, and I don't think I like it, partly because I like to drive. I don't want to give up. You know, there's the trade. I mean,
see earlier Woody Allen.
All we care about is minimizing our chances of dying every day. We wouldn't leave home. So there are a lot of decisions we make in life that make our lives more human and worth living, that also increase risk. But I don't think it's a good analogy to the lethal autonomy question, because we're talking about in the military sphere. We're talking about an area of life in which sometimes it is okay to kill, sometimes it is necessary to kill, and sometimes it is absolutely not okay to kill. And people have to make decisions on the battlefield constantly about the distinction between when it's all right to kill and when it's not all right to kill. That's different from the Google car scenario, where the directive is very simple: thou shalt never kill. One should always try to avoid hurting any other human being.
Should always try.
And so the issue is the error rate, right? But it's not about whether the fancy computer that Google puts in the car is capable of deciding when it is necessary to kill a pedestrian and when it is absolutely forbidden to kill a pedestrian.
I agree, but I think that this is why I think it's so relevant is we're talking about the use of an autonomous system with the same set of sensors that will be used on these military systems, right? So if you want to track what the likelihood of an autonomous system is to be able to actually get to the point where it could do lethal reasoning, you have to watch what's going on with the Google car, because it is a real world, in your life, everyday technology where we're seeing an ethical debate that should be happening, which is not happening. And I just to provoke you even more, to let you know what the state of the politics are, kind of under the radar, Google hired away the DARPA head of DARPA. And why does that matter? Well, because she knows everything that's been developed, both in the overt sense and the covert sense, meaning in the black world, you know, all the black technologies. And so she's on the leading edge of all the crazy technologies coming out. They basically, I mean, in the middle of her tenure, she walked away and started working for Google. You know, not surprising, I guess. About 8 months later, they hired the head of NHTSA. And the NHTSA government servant another one went over to Google. Now they've actually kind of cornered the market on crazy technologies of the future, and the head of a regulatory agency that's that potentially could have stood in their way, and now works for them. So I think that the reasons that you need to ask yourself, so it's a much more complicated piece of the pie. And if we have technologies that are actually being put in our lives, with the understanding that, you know, in California, Nevada right now, a regulation have already decided for you, you could be killed by this car, and that's okay. And so if we're making that kind of policy and law decision in our own country, then we have to ask ourselves, well, okay, so it's great that we're going to try to set international law, but we didn't look too far within our own selves.
Let me invite questions now from the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
Why is it worse to be killed by a robotic car or robotic sniper than to be killed by crossfire by a police officer or run over by any of the idiots who let drive?
Well, you know, I think that if you're asking me that question, this is where I slide, and I kind of agree with Tom, and I've actually written some articles on this. In the end, I just personally fundamentally believe that a human should be held accountable for actions that take another life, right? and that police officer maybe will be held accountable, or, you know, the crazy driver or whatever. And you know, maybe this shows my own age, but it also shows my technical distrust of the system that I work within. I just don't think the systems themselves are at that place where they should be allowed to do it either.
Right, so that's a technology, that's the
Right.
technology not being good enough, but in 50, 60 years, is there actually...
Well, but now I'm going to side with Ben, so you said this is why I guess they put me in the middle. I'm going to say, but it could change in the future. I mean, you know, I also know about the neuromuscular lag, and I work in that world every day. And I wouldn't want to rule that out. So I agree that at this day and time, you know, I do not want autonomous systems making decisions that could end my life. But I also agree that we don't know where the future is. And so, but this is why you're lawyers and I'm not. Presumably you can construct some language to reflect that at some point in time. I mean, that's what you do.
Sure, go ahead. I'll be next.
This is fantastic and interesting. I have some questions, but I guess bringing that up, so in terms of accountability, where are we legally right now in terms of sort of supervisory accountability for autonomous systems? Is there any law out there?
No, but it hasn't been tested because we don't have the systems deployed.
This is why it's great to be a lawyer in the year 2013, because there's a whole new field opening up.
Mm-hmm. So there's nothing, in other words, there's nothing, where do we even look to start guiding that question then?
That's up for debate. You know, if a autonomous military weapon kills a civilian and, you know, it's wrong, it shouldn't have happened, who's accountable for that? Is it the developer, is it the programmer, the developer of the weapon? Is it the military officer who signed the order to deploy the weapon? Is it nobody? There may be an answer to that question, but we haven't answered it, and it's one of the concerns that many people have raised about going to full autonomy.
And again, I think that, you know, Missy's analogy to the Google cars here is a very interesting one and a very useful one. I suspect some of those questions, because the military does not, in fact, deploy autonomous systems with firing power right now, but there are these areas of life in which we are starting to do it, including, you know, vacuuming your living room. What happens the first time such systems on their own cause somebody massive damage? And you know, and what will reliability for that? You know, I suspect those will be highly contextual. Who's the driver for purposes of a driverless car? You know, who's the party who's actually responsible for that? I don't know the answer to that, but you know, I think some of those principles that may develop in completely unrelated areas will have, you know, will have sort of blowback in this space over time.
And to that point, and this is going to sound like a glib example, but I think it's maybe instructive. I have a Roomba and I have a cat. If the Roomba attacked the cat and killed the cat, I would be, you know, calling my lawyer going after Roomba. Yeah, but I mean, I think this liability issue becomes a place where maybe these things start to get fleshed out a bit as people sort of integrate this technology that's very convenient into their lives, but then maybe it does something really awful and causes, you know, great damage and trauma. So you had a question too.
Yeah, Tom Leary, I'm an active duty Navy jet instructor in my personal capacity. My question, I think, is principally for Tom. With regard to the international agreement or whatever formulation of the policy that you would see developing, would you see it consistent with sort of the Chemical Weapons Convention, Biological Convention, with restrictions on development of the capability, or something more narrowly focused just on the use of the capability to take life?
Right. That's an important and complicated question. In our initial report on this, Human Rights Watch, we followed the language that's sort of standard language in arms control treaties and called for a ban on everything from development to production to use. I think, you know, in subsequent discussions like this one that we've had, I've come to the conclusion that probably a ban on development is not realistic in this sphere in the way that it would have been realistic in the chemical or biological weapon sphere, simply because there will be so much work on robotics and autonomy that is so similar to the work that would be required to develop a fully autonomous weapon that to ban it would be to ban all kinds of useful applications, and and it wouldn't be necessary. So what I'm focused on right now, we're not writing a treaty. What I'm focused on is the fundamental principle that there should be a human being in the loop. I mean, you can state it in positive terms, in addition to stating it in negative terms. That should be the principle that forms the basis of any treaty or agreement or regime that nations adopt, and then there will be practical principles that flow from that. I would think banning production of weapons that are designed to be used autonomously would have to be part of the package, because one of my goals is to make sure that nefarious actors aren't able to acquire these things in large numbers. But I think a ban on development would probably be unrealistic.
So this actually dramatically narrows the field of dispute between Tom and me. When he and I had a written debate on this subject some months ago, right? One of the things that I focused on in that wasn't the only thing, but it was one of the things I focused on was the development component of the original Human Rights Watch report. I think if Human Rights Watch is institutionally willing to back off that principle, there is much greater room for common ground than if not, because then that brings you much closer to the idea that is sort of central to me, which is a certain agnosticism about where this all is going. If you're not precluding the research, the development, the exploration of, and I'm not arguing that we should go build and deploy these things, then you're not. It's not quite clear what the sort of acute area of disagreement is.
I think we have time for one more question. Yeah.
Well, I'll give it to somebody else because mine kind of draws on that same point.
Go ahead if you want.
All right. I didn't really quite understand, but with consideration of like the genie in the bottle argument and the policy of not deploying this technology can autonomously kill, is it possible to deploy and develop this technology without it getting, to draw a parallel back to the nuclear argument, you can clearly develop nuclear power without it being used as weaponized capacity? Is it possible to give an Iron Dome defense or even a Google car without it being turned into snipers on the lampposts, automatically killing suicide bombers?
So autonomy for some applications, but not for others.
How divorced is the technology from it being used in a weaponized kind of killing capacity?
Well, the knowledge will exist, right? And certainly 50 years from now, we will have so much autonomy in so many different spheres that will use similar concepts that if a country or countries decided, treaty or no treaty, we're going to start building this stuff, and they had the industrial capacity to do it, yeah, they could. And so, you have the norm to try to prevent that leak, the construction, the putting together of the sensor and the computer and all of the learning that has gone into building the car, into building an autonomous drone that can take out your enemies without a human being intervening. That would be the point. But yeah, certainly the capacity will exist. The enforcement of such a treaty would be complicated, and that's something that proponents have begun to think about. And there are technological difficulties and proposed technological fixes in terms of how you would verify that a country is not actually deploying weapons like that. How do you distinguish a fully autonomous weapon from, say, a remote-controlled weapon like our current generation of drones? It can be done, but it's a challenge.
It's not realistic to think that the technology is going to be developed and then not imagined or applied in lethal areas. I mean, the technologies in question, and I feel a little bit awkward about describing the technologies in question sitting next to Missy, but she'll correct me if I'm wrong. The technologies in question involve essentially three major ideas, right? One is sensing information, and the second is processing that, figuring out what it means, and the third is taking some action based on it. The elements of those three major gestalt ideas that are involved in weapons systems are all going to be developed anyway. Better sensory understanding of what's going on, better ability to process that information, figure out what it means and what you should do about it, and 3, better ability to execute some command in the kinetic in a kinetic fashion. So I think the question really does come down to a norm question. Once you've achieved a certain level of proficiency in those areas, the question, as Tom says, comes down to a sort of norm question. Is it okay to use that for a system that decides on its own to take somebody's life? And that's but I don't think there's any prospect of our developing the capacity, or anybody's developing the capacity in the following, crop dusting, flying planes or, passenger planes, doing transactions in stores, all those sort of day-to-day interactions, but it having no military applications and being sort of technically walled off from lethal applications.
Missy, do you want to make a final comment on anything?
Not really, other than to say, it's just a flip of a switch. It's just 2 lines of code that take a non-lethal system to be a lethal system. It's so easy to weaponize an autonomous system. I mean, so, I agree. But I mean, once the autonomous system has been developed, it's such a fine line between, that next step to a level of, is it the human in the loop? Is the human? There's something called management by exception, and this is how the Patriot system works today, that it flashes up, I've got a lock, this is a bad guy, and if you do not say no, I'm going to fire in 15 seconds. 2, I'm just going to fire in 15 seconds. That's a very fine line. So I don't think I don't think in any kind of treaty would ever be able to effectively address that.
Well, thank you all for a really stimulating and interesting discussion, and obviously we're just at the beginning of something very big and new. And thank you all for coming and giving us the opportunity to discuss it. Great.